gentlemen, welcome to this faith debate. It's a Westminster Faith Debate. It's the last in our current series, and it's on what we do about radicalisation in schools. My name's Linda Woodhead. I'm Professor of Sociology of Religion at Lancaster University, and I run these debates with my colleague who's a visiting professor there, Charles Clark.
We could hardly hit a more contemporary discussion for this final debate: what should schools do about radicalisation? And that is in itself controversial. The government has made proposals which come into effect today, giving schools responsibilities in this area, and there's a lot of discussion about whether it's right to do that, whether that's the right way to do it, whether it works, is effective or not. My own view, and Linda shares this very much, is that we need to look again at the whole relationship between religion and schools. So we published a couple of weeks ago, a document in a new settlement, Religion and Belief in Schools, which we jointly authored, saying that the 70 years since the 1944 Education Act needs to be re-examined, and the settlement between religion and schools dealing with issues like the act of collective worship, the RE curriculum, the way faith schools operate needs to be looked again in the modern era of how schools are now and how religion is now, very different obviously to what it was in 1944. We're delighted that our first speaker is Zara Jaffer. She's the Senior Vice Principal at the Skinner Academy in Hackney, part of London where many of these issues are very, very sharp issues and being considered very carefully by teachers and by the schools.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. And when we're talking about radicalisation, radicalisation is part of the safeguarding framework for all schools, and it is just one of many safeguarding concerns and issues that schools have to undertake in ensuring that we protect our young people from. So earlier on this year, we had the Prevent workshop, which was about raising awareness about Prevent, and we had that for the whole staff. And whilst it did exactly what it said it set out to do, which was to raise awareness about radicalisation, it left the school actually with more questions. And those questions were more to do with, well, okay, it's easy to spot a child who's actually got extremist views and is shouting it across the playground, but how do we know which pupil is actually going to be vulnerable? Who is it that we're looking out for? And actually, when we look at that, we're not talking about just vulnerable per se, just about radicalisation. We don't, as a school, want to make it as narrow as that. We want to see which young person is going to be vulnerable from all kinds of safeguarding concerns. All our young people need to have a sense of belonging in the academy community. And secondly, we need to look at how they deal with uncertainties. And we've brought in a project that is a project that Young Minds support, and it's about how young people look at adversity, cope with it, and it does stem back to how they feel they belong. Community cohesion is a huge part of this, and along with identity, once you form an identity, we need to know that all these multiple identities under the umbrella of being British all can fit together. And lastly, the involvement of parents. We have to work collectively with parents to make sure that they understand, young people understand, that what they may view as normalised behaviour and is certainly not normalised, and we need to challenge those concepts. But we have to do that with a child-centred, focused approach where all communities are joined in to challenge this horrific crime of radicalisation.
The most recent faith debate we had was actually in Bradford on social cohesion across the Pennines. And I say that introducing our next speaker, Paul Thomas, who's Professor of Youth and Policy at the School of Education at the University of Huddersfield. Paul.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe start with a couple of contextual points then about Prevent. Although we've had Prevent since 2007, it's only very recently that schools have come to the forefront of that. For the majority of the time with Prevent, the focus on young people has been about engagement in the community, and I think it's only with the Syria crisis and the Trojan horse incident that really schools have come to the forefront. So I think schools have suddenly come under quite a lot of pressure through the Ofsted framework and now the legal duty. So we've obviously got to find ways of helping schools practically meet those legal duties. But I think at the same time, we need to step back and acknowledge that this radicalisation concept is highly problematic. The academic evidence is that it's not a very helpful concept. We know there's things happening, but radicalisation it's got very weak predictive power in terms of even if people express extreme views, will they go on and do things? And the evidence is it's not a good indicator. So models are not really available, and we need to bear that in mind. So we need to get more radical politics and radical issues into school, not less. We actually need young people talking about topical political issues, more focused on having difficult conversations, both in initial teacher training and in CPD, because it isn't easy having those debates, but we need to give teachers and heads license, and politicians need to license schools to have difficult debates. But we can immediately see the tension that on the one hand, schools are being asked to spot people who express radical views. I'm arguing we need to encourage young people to discuss radical views as the best possible antidote. So I'm basically arguing we need to focus much more on education. We need to trust education and trust educators. Will that prevent any individuals going towards terrorism? No, but no preventative soft policies will. And anyone who says that they will is being dishonest. But what we do with education, if we trust in education, is actually we're showing congruence with the values we claim we're defending in the face of terrorism. Because at the moment, prevent is not congruent. It's stigmatising, it's counterproductive.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. That's fascinating. Thank you. Sarah Marsden, Dr. Sarah Marsden, comes at it from the security and fighting political violence end. She's a lecturer at the Hander Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews. Thank you for coming down from St Andrews today.
Fewer than 450 people have been convicted of terrorism-related offences in the UK between 2001 and December 2014. Now, notwithstanding the recent increase in arrests in relation to the conflict in Syria, that's a relatively small number from which to develop a really good understanding of who might be at risk of involvement in terrorism. Attempts to identify a terrorist profile or a radicalisation pathway have, largely, fallen foul of the complex and heterogeneous nature of militants and their journeys. Similarly, assuming that radicalisation is primarily concerned with attitudes, efforts to predict who may use violence on the basis of expressed attitudes runs up against psychological studies which demonstrate that attitudes are actually a somewhat inconsistent predictor of what people will actually go on to do. And that makes it problematic to demand that educators try and identify those they consider vulnerable to not only extremism, but non-violent extremism, as the new Counter-Terrorism and Security Act does. Not only because it's difficult to identify them, but because asking educators to do so poses risks to the relationship of trust between student and teacher. And through the politicisation and securitisation of educational settings, which many argue should be protected spaces where young people can learn about the world and about themselves in a safe environment. In my research with those people who work with those who've been involved in radical subcultures, I've seen the positive effects of creating safe spaces for risky conversations. Whether that's a soldier explaining to deeply suspicious young men what being in the armed forces means to him, that it's a career, one that gives him purpose, and that he didn't join up to kill Muslims. Or whether it's a former militant explaining that conflict's frequently traumatic and the people prosecuting them often corrupt. Instead of trying to impose answers about difficult political issues on young people, we should perhaps begin by asking them the questions. If we don't, there's a risk that notions of extremism and moderation are defined for political purposes or by recourse to an abstract set of poorly defined values, rather than in relation to part of a shared social project of which they can feel a part.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Our final panellist is Tom Holland. He's very keen for me to emphasise that he's not an expert in the educational world and in schools. What he is an expert in is history and classical history. He's written a number of very highly celebrated books, but his newest book is the reason why we asked Tom to come today. It's called In the Shadow of the Sword, and it deals with the emergence of Islam and how it has developed in the way that it did.
I've got to put my hands up and say that I have no great detailed knowledge of extremism either, or the issues that surround it. So much so that I actually looked up this evening the Home Office definition of an extremist. And one of the phrases immediately caught my eye, and that is an extremist is someone who does not accept the rule of law. And of course, an acceptance of the rule of law, I would guess, is pretty fundamental to both the functioning of the state and how most British people see themselves. Zara talked about fundamental British values. I would guess that a pride in the common law would certainly be one of those values. And in this year of all year, the anniversary of Magna Carta, we've had an opportunity to explore the inheritance of that value that we put on the law. However, there is a problem, which is that, as we've seen with all the people who have been heading out to Syria and Iraq to sign up to the Islamic State, there are people in Britain who really couldn't care less about Magna Carta. Rebellious teenagers have always enjoyed the idea that they have a right and a duty to ignore the law. It was what being a hippie was about in the 60s. It was what being a punk was about in the 70s. But Islam has a particular appeal, I think, for rebellious teenagers because it brings with it the heft of a great and ancient religion. And that gives it a quality that being a hippie or being a punk just doesn't bring. And the issue of how, then, schools are to deal with this is part of a much broader question, and essentially it revolves around the question of how the legal understandings, the legal systems of Islam and the secular West are to be squared. And it does seem to me, if teachers can come up with a solution to this problem, that's absolutely brilliant. I hope that they will pass it on to all the rest of us, because at the moment it seems to me that the government, the media, the security services, pretty much everyone is struggling with this question. And I think that actually the question of radicalization in schools is about far more than schools. Ultimately, it's about an issue that at the moment seems to me to have no clear answer that affects the whole of society.
Let me just kick off by coming to the point that a number of you raised. Should schools be trying to deal with radicalisation? Is it right that schools should do this? Is the government right to try and encourage schools to do this? Should the government be providing resources to help schools to do this? Or is it a barren hope? Is it actually a hopeless task in these current circumstances?
In 1944, just before the Second World War ended, with the threat of fascism and communism as the background, the government negotiated a settlement for how religion is treated in schools. And that was the background. The background was to try and put in place, a good religious cultural grounding which would immunize people against those sorts of extremism, the extremisms of their day. And the way that was thought appropriate to do that was to have the Christian faith, what Winston Churchill called county council religion, one kind which all the churches who were then dominant could agree on, and that would be taught in schools. So there was a positive religious message being put forward, which was seen to be underpinning of what we'd now call British values.
The glorious hypocrisy that lies at the heart of British public life is never more evident than in the discussions of religion, and the whole thought for the day model, which essentially operates on the presumption that all religions are basically the same and that they all subscribe to the same sort of comfy liberal values. And that's what will get you on Thought for the Day. You're not going to get on Thought for the Day if you say that homosexuals should be stoned. There is a problem with that now, that essentially the limits of that hypocrisy, that sort of calculated turning of a blind eye to the awkwardness with this situation is starting to sort of break out. And I think the time has come where we actually have to face up to some of the fact that some of the problems with what we're calling radicalization, and essentially it's Islamic radicalization, are ideological and do derive from the stuff of Islamic scripture.
I think taking a broader take on looking at religion, I think we have an issue that we've got an asymmetrical reality developing, that religion is much more important in some communities now than others. So there's really good interfaith work happens, like in the north of England, but it's only a majority of white ex-Christian young people where religion is important, whereas religious identity is very important for young Muslims. So I think using faith as a sort of as a forum for discussing community cohesion and extremism across communities is very problematic. In fact, I think the loss of identity in a lot of white working class communities is partly about loss of religion and identity in a modern way being expressed through religion. So I think some of the white Islamophobia maybe towards modern Islam in Britain, I would say, is partly a fear of expressed religion generally from communities where religious practice and religious identity is largely gone. And
I think it depends on how you think about religion being relevant to radicalisation. The extent to which you consider religion to be a causal factor, something that actually pushes somebody, they read or learn of something and then that motivates them in this sort of straightforward path, is a nonsense. It doesn't work that way. As much as we know, there are huge numbers of factors.
I mean, we have a majority Christian, but we have a significant cohort of Muslim pupils as well. So those two religions are really the key focus for our RE education. But coming to that point, I mean, I think religious education's got a very prominent role in this, because it's about religious literacy, to understand that whilst there is a very small minority of people who take the take that Tom is talking about, there is a vast majority of Muslim people who live in and who abide by British value, make a significantly positive contribution to British society. What's happening in this so-called the Islamic State, you know, is in fact totally contrary to what the vast majority of Muslims globally, nearly we're talking about 2 billion people, abide to. So I think it's got a real place to, and we need to have those discussions.
I think it's fairly true to say that in RE provision in state schools, one of the ingredients that is quite often missing at the moment is a sense of the history of religions and the sociology of religions. And I'm wondering whether the panel would like to comment on the absence of that and the extent to which that may impact on people's views about religion and their ability to argue critically about it. If you've got a good grasp of how a particular religion has changed over centuries or millennia, are you more likely perhaps to be resistant to moral binaries, for example?
I wanted to say that there's a subtlety to being an RE teacher, or even any teacher in those schools, which is that they're actually interpreters almost between cultures, between two cultures, between or more, and between different religions, between politics, between different ideas of democracy and dislike of democracy or concern about democracy. And actually, I think if your teachers actually need to have a greater understanding of Islam in order to have a greater opportunity to have those discussions with pupils and to help them understand their own relationship with their own religion.
Primarily the people who are radicalized and who perhaps go and travel to Syria or wherever, it's actually the cause is an ignorance of their own religion rather than a good understanding of their religion. And hence going back to the roles that schools can play, where you have an opportunity during a period in a person's life to actually teach them about not only other religions, but actually teach them about their religion so they can get a better understanding and create a space where these issues can be openly discussed rather than some kind of regime that we've seen in other instances in history whereby children and parents and schools are all encouraged to spy on each other.
I think, however, problematically, that it is precisely the violence and the supremacism of these narratives that appeals to people who may be working, I don't know, as a shelf stacker in High Wycombe, or kind of boy who isn't getting girls in a bedsit in Glasgow. The problem is that we assume that if we tell people who are drawn to Islamic State that, hey, you know, these guys are not liberal, these are not nice people, they know that. That's what's turning them on, that's what's attracting them.
I think the evidence that going to Syria being radicalised has anything to do with Islam as a religion is pretty weak, to be honest. I mean, the latest evidence from Belgium about Belgians who've gone to Syria is that they are very young, they're socially excluded, socially marginalised, they've had virtually no involvement in Islam in any organised form. And I think its attractions towards youth criminal gangs probably tells us much more than anything about Islam as a religion or teachings. I think we end up having cross conversations about some of these issues.
In my understanding and the way I see it, religion is the framework within which organisations like ISIS operate. It's the framework, it sets out a series of goals, and it provides a space that individual experiences and individual needs can be fulfilled. Some of those are religious, many are not. So in response to your question, I think that if certain aspects of religion are taught more effectively, and if religious literacy is higher, that will have some kind of protective factor. But I think that notion of a redemption of self is actually really important, but I'm not entirely sure whether it has to be a religious one.
Religion isn't one thing that's separate from politics and identity, and it's sticky. It sticks to images of gender and politics and whatever. So it's a bit of a false debate, this one, about is it religious or is it not?
I think one of the things we need to do is not just look at the message. Yes, the message might attract some people, but it doesn't necessarily attract most people. In fact, it's the method that attracts most people. And we have a massive job to do in religious education in educating our young people about the methods, providing them with a toolbox to protect themselves.
The small number of people who do actually mobilise versus those people who are broadly sympathetic to the ideological political claims of groups like ISIS, it's the recruitment process and the mobilisation process that helps to explain a lot of that gap. And I absolutely agree that I'm not quite sure what the mechanism might be, but if you can help people understand how recruitment works, you have a very strong message in terms of resilience. Those people who come out of radical settings often feel very betrayed when they learn how they were recruited, when they learn the techniques and the processes that they use to try and manipulate them. And I think it is a really powerful message, and I think that's where we'll find some more causal explanations, perhaps more usefully than looking at very big geopolitical and ideological questions.
We're hearing about younger and younger pupils being exposed to, sort of radical and extremist sort of like behaviour. But if we could tailor that, I think that'd be really powerful. But again, I would re-emphasise the point that is actually something that's not just about radicalisation. That also can be applied to child sexual exploitation. It can be about gang affiliation. All of those things when you are taken where it is just an abuse of power. And until we recognise that all of this is talking about how we can safeguard young people where people take advantage of them, we will be still coming across more and more safeguarding concerns.
What struck me was that very few of you actually talked about teachers and how we can support teachers, because I think what was very clear was the importance of teachers in helping children to create that resilience.
I am wondering on the subject of supporting teachers, whether or not the wider curricular framework in which education is falling into is maybe the biggest part of the problem, because at present, my understanding, as somebody who works inside education on an itinerant basis, is that teachers are increasingly under pressure to survive in their posts by achieving grades.
My name's Rebecca Sefton and I'm a religious education teacher as well. Really, I just want to stick up for us, to be honest, because I kind of feel like we're sitting here and being told that we've not been trained, we haven't got the knowledge, we need to go out and learn all of this. And I actually think that we are sort of being tasked with solving this problem of radicalisation. I actually think when you look at our curriculum in religious education, particularly the GCSE, we're dealing with community cohesion fuzz that has been put together to sort of make everyone get along. And I think the real problem is, like you say, we're just not dealing with the controversial issues, the critical issues. We're not asking kids to think. We're saying, what do you think about this, and giving them marks for it. And I just feel like it might not be a problem with our training, but actually a problem with, again, the way that we're viewed in schools. We're not high on the agenda. Nobody values us as a subject. We don't have the same respect that history and geography have, for example. And then we're being sort of tasked with this solve radicalisation. And I just don't know if that's possible in the way that RE is actually valued in schools and the curriculum that we've got.
I'm sure that you, as an RE teacher, as well as anyone, would appreciate the fact that actually what we've lived through over the past few decades is a moral and ethical revolution of a speed and a totality that is pretty unprecedented in the history of human culture. Homosexuality is a classic example. It was criminalised until relatively recently by historical terms. now people of religious background face prosecution if they are opposed to it. And I think that the challenge for RE teachers to explain this and to negotiate this, because it must generate all kinds of confusions among students, as it does among society generally.
Prevent budget is reduced. So youth workers, which is my background, have been cut out of Prevent. Youth workers have got the skills to do this in the community, and they've been cut out completely. So policy at the moment is not serious about using the range of educational interventions with young people to do the sort of work I've done. At the moment, it's in police salaries, and I'm arguing an educational policy should be run by educationists, not by police officers.
Unfortunately, about value, yeah, we've got to spread that burden. It can't be just within RE going, to save the day and to spot radicalisation. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where if RE only featured as part of the EBAC, perhaps we would have a very different conversation then. And and certainly I would like to see a time when PSHE and citizenship are also recognised qualifications. If we are really adamant that young people need to learn about safeguarding issues, then why are we not having a qualification that actually says they have known this, have had a curriculum which has actually dealt with all the issues that we're talking about here?
Well, I think we've had a fantastic evening. Before thanking the panel, just a couple of reflections that I've drawn from this evening. The first is it's reinforced much more strongly than I expected, but very clearly, the critical importance of changing education about religion in our schools. I think the other set of dimensions are all around the point about the models, recruitment, grooming, online, all the techniques of approaches and trying to build awareness in schools of how that works and what goes on. I've been very encouraged by the whole conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. I do want to thank the panel very much for giving time to come. So all of you, Zara, Paul, Sarah and Tom, thank you very, very much indeed for giving your time this evening.